Okay, as with all family fights, many people are asked to choose sides. General Winfield Scott asked Robert E. Lee to command the Union troops. Lee was one of the best senior officers in the United States Army at the time. Lee, however, was from Virginia, so when his state vetoed to secede, Lee chose to support the Confederacy. Hundreds of other military officers chose to support the Confederacy. The South had a strong military tradition. 7 of the 8 military colleges were located in the South, so the South had a large number of trained officers. The North had a strong naval tradition. 3/4 of the U.S. Navy's officers were from the North. Hey, look at that. The North had a large pool of trained sailors from merchant ships to draw upon to help them with the Navy. Okay, so let's talk about the economies here. So the North's population was about twice as large as the South's population. This gave the North an advantage in raising an army and in supporting the war. The North's industries gave it an economic advantage over the South. So the North had almost 90% of the country's factories, and it could provide ammunition and other supplies very easily to the Union armies. The South had only one railroad line connecting the western states of the Confederacy to the east. Northern troops easily disrupted the South's rail system and prevented the distribution of supplies and troops. The North had several financial advantages over the South as well. The North controlled the national treasury and was able to continue collecting money from tariffs at this time. Northern banks loaned the federal government money by buying government bonds. Congress passed the Legal Tender Act in February of 1862, which created a national currency and allowed the governments to issue green-colored paper money known as greenbacks. The Confederacy's financial situation was not good to start, and it continued to worsen. Southern planters and banks could not buy bonds. The Union Navy blockaded the southern ports, so money raised by taxing trade was greatly reduced. To raise money, the South taxed its own people. Many Southerners refused to pay the taxes, and the South was forced to print its own paper money, which caused rapid inflation in the southern states. So, as the Civil War began, there were many Republicans and Northern Democrats who challenged Lincoln's policies. Lincoln's goal was to preserve the Union first, even if that meant allowing slavery to continue. The War Democrats supported the Civil War and restoring the Union. They opposed ending slavery. The Peace Democrats, were referred to as Copperheads by Republicans, opposed the war. They wanted to reunite the states by using negotiation. In 1862, Congress introduced a militia law that allowed states to use conscription, the drafting of people for military service to fill their regiments. Many Democrats opposed the law, and riots erupted in many cities. To enforce the militia law, Lincoln suspended writs of habeas corpus, which is a person's right not to be imprisoned unless charged with a crime and given a trial. The Confederate Constitution's commitment to states' rights limited Confederate President Jefferson Davis's ability to conduct the war. Many Southern leaders opposed President Jefferson Davis's policies. They objected to the Confederacy forcing people to join the Army. They also opposed suspending writs of habeas corpus. Okay, so the diplomatic challenges. The United States did not want Europeans to recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent country. So, the South wanted Europeans to recognize the Confederacy and provide it with military assistance. To pressure France and Britain, Southern planters stopped selling cotton to these countries. In 1861, the Confederacy sent two diplomats to Britain and France. In the Trent Affair, a Union warship intercepted the British ship that the two men were on and arrested them. Eventually, they were freed, but the Confederacy failed to gain the support of the Europeans. Okay, so the Civil War is recognized as one of the first modern wars in world history. The war involved huge armies made up of mostly civilian volunteers who required vast amounts of supplies and equipment. New cone-shaped bullets used in the Civil War were more accurate and could be loaded and fired faster than previous bullets. Instead of standing in line, troops began to use trenches and barricades to protect themselves as in this type of warfare. New military technologies and tactics caused attacking forces to suffer high casualties. Attrition was the wearing down of one side by the other through exhaustion of soldiers and resources, meant that the armies had to keep replacing their soldiers. Jefferson Davis wanted to wage a defensive war of attrition against the Union. Southerners scorned defensive warfare, however. Southern troops instead often went on the offensive, charging enemy lines and suffering large numbers of casualties. The Union implemented the Anaconda Plan. This strategy, proposed by Winfield Scott, included a blockade of Confederate ports and sending gunboats down the Mississippi to divide the Confederacy. Okay, so mobilizing these troops. Confederate reinforcements at the First Battle of Bull Run turned the tide for the Confederacy in the first major battle. Reinforcing troops were led by Thomas J. Jackson, also known as Stonewall Jackson. He became one of the most effective commanders in the Confederate Army. At first, many northern and southern men enlisted in the armies. Now, as the war dragged on, fewer young men enlisted. The North tried to get volunteers to enlist by offering a bounty, an amount of money given as a bonus to men who enlisted for 3 years of military service. Eventually, both the Confederacy and the Union instituted the draft. Okay, so the Naval War. Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of all Confederate ports in an effort to cut the South's trade with the world. The Union ended up blockade became increasingly effective as the war went on. The Union Navy, however, could not stop all of the blockade runners, or small, fast vessels used by the South to smuggle goods past the blockade. A fleet of Union ships led by David G. Farragut captured New Orleans and gained control of the lower Mississippi River in 1862. The South's largest city and a center of the cotton trade was now in Union hands. That concludes our third video in this series on the Civil War. Look forward for the next one, which will bring us to the end of the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction. Thank you. As always, look for a quiz.